Welcome back to my podcast on theology and religion. For the last couple of episodes, we've examined the Markan and Matthean versions of Jesus' encounter with the Syrophoenician woman. We saw that Mark was teaching that both Jews and Gentiles could participate in the kingdom of God. We also saw that Matthew taught the same thing as Mark, but with an added focus on the Jews and Jewish Christians. Today, in part 3, we're going to determine the historicity of the story. Did the historical Jesus actually meet a Syrophoenician woman and pronounce an exorcism? To answer that question, we're going to use the same critical methods used by professional biblical historians to argue whether Jesus did or did not do this particular thing. Historical critics have developed a few tried-and-true criteria to give different levels of confidence to acts and sayings of Jesus. The best ones are the following. Multiple independent attestation is the first. This criterion means that a deed or saying of Jesus appears in two sources that they did not rely on each other for information. I misspoke a little bit there. The idea is that if you have two sources who tell the same story and they didn't borrow from each other, then it's more likely historical. And that's because it's tough for two writers to make up the same story independently. So the next criteria of historicity is the Criterion of Embarrassment. This means that if the New Testament records something in Jesus' life that would be embarrassing to the early Christians, then they probably didn't make it up. The third criterion is called discontinuity. This means that if a concept in Jesus' life recorded in the Gospels can't be found, either in the Jewish religion of Jesus' time or in the Christian church after him, then it is more likely to be historical. So those are just a few of the ways that historians try to determine whether something in the Gospels really happened or not. And I won't go out of my way to explain those too much here because we're going to have to talk about some different things here. All right, so can we use any of these primary criteria to judge whether the story of the Syrophoenician woman actually happened? Well, unfortunately, none of them do apply to this story. And that's for a few reasons. The story isn't multiply and independently attested. In other words, even though the story appears both in Mark and Matthew, it doesn't appear independently because we can see that Matthew used Mark's version. So we can't use that criterion. There's also nothing really embarrassing to the Christians here in this story, except maybe the comment about the dogs, but I would consider that type of comment to be more embarrassing to modern Christians than to ancient people, whether Jewish, Christian, or pagan. So we can't use the criterion of embarrassment because there really isn't anything that contradicts basic Christian theology in this passage that seems to appear on the lips of Jesus. And we also can't use the criterion of discontinuity because every concept in the story exists either in contemporary Judaism or the early church. For example, the idea that the Jews had a low view of the Gentiles and referred to them as dogs and that sort of thing. That appears in the Judaism of Jesus' time. But the fact that Jesus eventually does go out of his way and heal the woman's daughter, even though she's a Gentile, that betrays an early Christian understanding of how the Gentiles can become Christians. So no discontinuity here. You can find what Jesus is doing both in the traditions of Judaism and in early Christianity. So that kind of makes a problem here, we can't use the normal criteria of historicity to argue for the authenticity of the story. But so the fact that these criteria of historicity don't work is one of the main reasons that historical critics have considered the story non-historical. So, for instance, the most powerful argument from the skeptics is that the story betrays too much Christian evangelistic theology. And we talked about this a little bit more, but we'll explain some more here. In other words, both the Markan and Matthean versions of the story are clearly concerned with teaching that Gentiles can and should become followers of Jesus. But in my judgment, there's a problem with this argument. It basically just says, well, the criterion of discontinuity doesn't apply here, so that means the event most likely didn't happen. This is essentially a negative application of the criterion of discontinuity, and that's fallacious. So these criteria of historicity should only be used to add confidence in the historicity of a story. So the lack of the criteria being satisfied isn't an argument by itself that the story isn't true. It's just an argument that the criteria don't apply. So if that were the case, then we'd have to deny much of our knowledge of Jesus just because almost everything about him is not discontinuous. That is, he largely fits within his own times. So what I'm trying to say here is most of the historians will want to say, oh, the story betrays too much Christian evangelistic theology. They're basically just saying, oh, it's not discontinuous, so therefore it means it didn't happen. Well, that's fallacious like we just showed. Okay, so does this mean we have to say that the story is made up? Or does it mean that we can't comment on the historicity of it at all? Of course not. Even though the primary criteria don't apply here, we can still evaluate the historicity of the story. In my opinion, there are several good reasons to think that this episode in the Gospels does go back to the historical Jesus, even if the other criteria don't apply. So for one, I think we should put this story into the context of the rest of the Gospels. Jesus' reputation as a miracle worker is very well attested in Christian and Jewish sources. All of the independent Gospel sources, Q, M, L, Mark, and John, as well as the writings of the Jewish historian Josephus, attest that Jesus performed healings and exorcisms that his contemporaries interpreted as miracles. If the story of the Syrophoenician woman had appeared alone as a miracle story in Gospel tradition, then we could more easily label it as legendary. But that's not the case, so the story has a higher probability of being historical. Again, that's not one of the primary criteria of historicity, like the 3 or so that we mentioned before, but I do think that it is an important point to make. Additionally, there are some exceptional elements in the story that make it stand out compared to other miracle stories in the Gospels, which makes it seem more likely to be historical. So here, a woman asks Jesus for healing in Tyre. In no other place in the Gospels does a similar situation happen. Some scholars have argued that these exceptions reflect a strong memory that stood out in the disciples' minds. The story then could have survived oral transmission relatively easily until Mark received it and redacted it. In other words, the miracle story just doesn't look like your run-of-the-mill miracle story. There's something unique about it that probably is a result of an actual event that the disciples later transmitted through their oral tradition. Okay, so another reason that the story is historical is that the setting reflects what would have happened during Jesus' ministry. So Mark narrates that Jesus went into the rural region surrounding Tyre and not the city itself. Well, why does that matter? Well, by the time that the Gospels were written, a community of Christians already existed inside the city of Tyre. If the early Christians had invented the story, then it makes more sense that Mark would have made Jesus go into the city itself rather than wander around into a rural area, which is where the story takes place. And by the time of Jesus, the rural region of Tyre had a significant Jewish population in the form of small villages. It was from here that the revolutionary figure John of Gullotta later gained his most famous and fanatic followers during the Jewish revolt against Rome in the late 60s CE. Since there was a Jewish population in this area, then the historical Jesus had a reason to journey to that location. So in other words, it's not like the early Christians just made up this idea of the story of Jesus going to a totally Gentile area, which the historical Jesus probably wouldn't have done. No, there was a Jewish population there, and so it would have made sense for Jesus to go there. Not to mention, there was a mixture of Jews and Gentiles in the rural region of Tyre. So the archaeological studies of the area show that both groups of people interacted as well. Both the people of Tyre and the people of Galilee traded with each other around the time of Jesus, and we know this because Tyrian coins have been discovered in Galilee dating from the time frame. This makes it even more reasonable to think that Jesus would have gone to that area to minister. This last argument defeats another possible objection to the historicity of the story, which was that the Aramaic-speaking Jesus wouldn't have been able to communicate with a Greek-speaking Syrophoenician woman. The cultural mixing in the region of Tyre would have resulted in a larger percent of the population that could speak both languages. Additionally, many historians find it likely that Jesus knew at least some Greek anyway, so it's not like they couldn't have talked with each other. Okay, so I do think that the story of the Syrophoenician woman did happen in the life of the historical Jesus. The case for it isn't as strong as some other main events in Jesus' life, like his baptism or his crucifixion, but there are certainly good arguments that it happened. So it might not make the short list of historical sayings and deeds of Jesus, but I think it definitely makes the long list. So I hope you guys enjoyed this discussion. I know it was kind of short and maybe a little haphazard, but I hope that you'll be sure to stay tuned for new episodes. And if you're watching this on YouTube, please be sure to like and subscribe for future content. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.